Calls for an independent regulator to oversee the use of artificial intelligence by government agencies are the result of a report just out this morning. Last year, analysis by Internal Affairs and Statistics New Zealand documented some 32 algorithms in use by 14 agencies for a range of purposes, from ACC to Corrections, Ministry of Social Development and Police. The University of Otago Artificial Intelligence and Law Project study released this morning says New Zealand's becoming a world leader in predictive and analytics. Is that a word? But safeguards against their dangers are needed. The study, funded by the Law Foundation, is the first independent and multidisciplinary analysis of the use of AI by state agencies. One of the co-authors, the Otago University Associate Professor Colin Gavaghan, says artificial intelligence computer models raise many issues, including accuracy, transparency, control and bias. Good morning, Colin.
Good morning, Catherine.
So New Zealand's becoming a world leader in the use of algorithms, and is it analytics, analysis, or analytics? What's the word you use?
I think analytics, data analytics, I think is what we're talking about.
All right. We're becoming a world leader in what area of the use of algorithms?
Possibly not in government at the moment. I don't think we're out in front of everyone else in that regard. There's an awful lot of really excellent research going on here, though, in terms of data analytics and in developing of the software that we're using. I think we also have a chance to become a world leader in our responses to these technologies and hopefully to avoid the kind of pitfalls and mistakes that we've seen elsewhere.
Can we start to describe exactly how algorithms are being used? One example that wasn't put into use in New Zealand but is being used in the United States is a form of predictive modelling, and that was the tool that would indicate risk of child abuse within a home using a key number of data sets, not used to make decisions, but used to sit alongside the decision-making process that effectively people getting the incoming phone call would make.
Yeah.
What is actually in use in New Zealand? Could you give us the range of uses?
Sure. So they're being used across a bunch of agencies. They are being used, for example, in the criminal justice system here. And I should maybe say from the start that when we're talking about algorithms, we're talking about quite a wide range of different kinds of technologies. Some of these are fairly basic formula that could be basically carried out on a piece of paper, all the way up to kind of more complex kind of things. But they are being used in the criminal justice system, and they're being used to make, inform some really pretty important decisions about who gets released from prison and who gets kept in prison. We're seeing decisions about overstayers and whether the speed with which they're removed from the country. One of the most recent ones was the introduction of an algorithm by ACC to process applications and to decide which ones could be routinely paid out and which ones are a bit more complicated and have to go to a human being. So they're across a bunch of different agencies, tax as well. And what we imagine is, what we foresee is they're going to be used increasingly. It's going to become very, very tempting to use these tools.
In what ways are they being used? The prediction is one thing. Let's start with the justice system. Yeah. How do you write an algorithm that can predict likelihood of reoffending? What are the components of the instructions that make up the algorithm?
Well, there's a bunch of different variables can go into those calculations. Obviously, some of them are what are called static variables, and those are factors that the individual can't really change themselves. So circumstances about your upbringing, circumstances to do with your family and your connections, things that are actually beyond your control. And then we have what we call dynamic variables, which are elements that the individual has some degree of control over. For example, your behaviour while you're in prison, if you're a model prisoner, or if you reoffend. So there's a bunch of different things that can go into informing these sorts of decisions in the criminal justice system. There have been steps taken to avoid some of the more kind of questionable aspects. So, for example, race and ethnicity. There's a lot of concern about those being used to make those decisions. They aren't explicitly included, but that's not to say that they can't end up creeping back into the decisions for various kinds of reasons. For example, some of these other considerations can be quite close proxies for things like ethnicity.
Well, you mentioned postcode, for example. In some places, there may be a predominance of ethnicity in a particular suburb or a particular city that can end up becoming a proxy, whatever the ethnicity is.
Absolutely.
Can I ask, though, when it comes to their use in the criminal justice system, how do they sit? Who uses them, and at what point of decision making?
Well, they have been used to inform decisions about sentencing by judges. Now, to be clear, it's far from the only factor that's going to influence a judge's decision. There's all kinds of rules about the things judges have to take into account. And the risk of future reoffending is only one factor in this whole story. So we're not trying to paint too kind of bleak a picture in this regard. They're also being used by parole boards, for example, to help inform a decision about when someone should be released. And again, it's only one factor that should come into their overall decision. I think maybe the other thing that's worth making clear is we're not trying to paint some kind of picture of an otherwise perfectly impartial, unbiased justice system that's somehow under threat from algorithms. We know there are problems there already. And there is, in fact, the potential maybe for these tools to improve matters. But what we're saying is that steps can be taken now, before we go any further down this road of using this technology, to try and avoid some of the dangers, some of the problems that we've seen happen elsewhere.
But let's stay with the predictives now, because this goes to your point about the algorithm needing to be open. One of the points at which bias, an unconscious or unintended bias, or confirmation bias, which is that when you see the result that the model told you ought to get, one of the points about this is that if the initial information is not completely, reliable and valid, you can end up building the confirmation bias into the algorithm. And yes, it will show what it predicted to be correct. Because the system will play it out. And we see this, for example, I'd like you to speak to what was seen in the United States with the likes of profiling by police. Then you stop one person and not another person, and then that obviously boosts the statistics for the person you stopped, and it becomes systemic. Can we talk about how you can prevent that happening right at the outset, if you can?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, this has been a real concern. So one of the techniques that we came across in the States is a thing called predictive policing. So understandably, when police are making decisions about where to deploy officers on a Saturday night, they want to have a kind of heads up, if they can, about what are likely to be crime hotspots, and that's what they'll prioritise. But of course there's a danger, because if you flood these areas that you've predicted to be high crime areas, if you flood them with police officers, then they're likely to catch more people who are drunk and disorderly, who are maybe in possession of drugs or weapons, and you get this runaway feedback loop. You risk this self-fulfilling prophecy that what the system predicted is what's going to happen, because you've made it happen in a way. So steps are being taken to remedy that. One of the things you can do, for example, you can say as well, when we are measuring the success of that prediction, we won't include the stop and searches that only happened because we flooded the area with police. We'll only include reported crime rather than discovered crime. So we get a cleaner data set, really, to test our prediction.
Another matter, speaking of self-fulfilling prophecy, and could you speak again to the judge's situation? The tool might be suggesting this individual should not be released or should have a long sentence. What happens to the judge's learning and human experience over many, many years, and what one might call gut instinct, which is never going to solely determine a decision, but might say, I'm giving this person a chance because I see X, Y, Z? Is the risk that the user, judge or anyone else, begins to prioritise the tool rather than the opportunity that they see in front of them that goes against what the tool is saying?
We've come across this a lot. There's been a lot of research in this area in kind of human factors psychology. So, for example, people who work with autopilot systems and pilots trying to work alongside these systems. Now, in theory, they're just meant to support the human decision-making. In theory, the human is able to make an independent assessment. But the reality is, unfortunately, that we're not very good at that. And these kind of concerns you identified there, decisional atrophy, automation bias, these are real concerns. We're just not very good at it would seem, operating alongside these systems and retaining some kind of decisional autonomy. So we've warn that there's a real danger here that we become over-reliant on this idea that keeping a human in the loop will somehow guard us against all of the concerns that we have here. In actual fact, we have to be very careful about that because it's not something we're very good at doing at all.
Well, the other point is someone doesn't want to find out down the track that they made a decision that went against what the tool said and it went wrong. So the human butt-covering instinct can be in play here as well if this is not carefully designed. Speaking of self-fulfilling prophecies, I think this was also where the concern was around the use of predictive tools in child welfare that might use very blunt measurements like, I don't know, age of parent, welfare information, have there been previous convictions as the parent in a job, all these sorts of things, is that the individual themselves can internalise the message they are getting from a state agency.
Sure.
And the expectations, or in the education system or anywhere else. And that can work against bucking what the data says might happen. So again, is this the sort of too much weight being put on the machine that needs to be guarded against?
It's such a hard one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I mean, we all understand that predictions have to be made in various parts. I mean, we don't release all prisoners, we don't detain all prisoners. When it comes to at-risk children, obviously we want the most accurate predictions we can reasonably get. But there is a danger that data becomes destiny, and that, again, we're creating these self-fulfilling prophecies whereby people who are flagged up as being at high risk for some reason, as you say, perceive themselves as being perceived in a particular way. And that is a real tricky one. I mean, one of the tensions we've identified in this project is between, for example, fairness or certain concepts of fairness and accuracy. If you wanted the most accurate predictions you could possibly get, there's a whole bunch of variables you might want to include that are correlated with the outcomes in question. But the real question is about whether it's fair to judge people on the basis of things like what other members of their family have done or what their parents did. That's not something you have any control over. I mean, you're talking about sections of the population that are already stigmatised quite substantially. That can be a real issue.
Can you tell me some of the other ways in which AI tools, algorithm tools, are being used as part of decision making? Are there some areas where it looks a bit more straightforward than those that are highly human, human factors in play?
I think so, yes. I mean, actually, to some extent, our reports are better the good news story for New Zealand. It's not a complacent story, but some of what we're doing is looking like fairly good practice. But you're absolutely right to say some kinds of decisions seem like the kind of things that could be reasonably automated. So, for example, if you look at what ACC are doing at the moment, you make your application, if you sprain your ankle or something, you make your application to ACC, a couple of days off your work and a visit to the GP. If the algorithm looks at that application, says everything looks in order, that can be put through the books very quickly and you get everything you need very quickly. If it looks more complicated, then it gets passed on to a human operator. So, we're quite open to the possibility that some kinds of decisions, by their nature, they're quite simple, they're not very high risk, and there's not a massive problem perhaps with those being automated. But the further you move up that spectrum, decisions about who gets to be a citizen, who gets to stay in the country, who gets to stay in prison, who gets to keep their kids, these are some of the most important decisions government can ever make about you. And that's where we think a closer bit of monitoring and scrutiny is really called for.
Did you get much information about what these algorithms were, what the factors were that were being computed into the model?
Again, in New Zealand, the story is quite a happy one. Most of and that's, I think, largely because most of the algorithms our government are using are either designed in-house by the government agencies or they're designed by local companies, some of whom we spoke to, and they're pretty open. They're pretty good about allowing their code and the variables to be shown. Some of what we've seen overseas has been a lot less happy in that regard. There have been concerns about trade secrecy. There have been concerns even about courts and judges not being able to open the black box and see how the decision's made. And that's a pretty big deal because really in a democracy we should be able to check and challenge the decisions that are made about us. Mistakes happen, and you can only really see if mistakes have happened if you have some sense of how the decision was arrived at. Now at the moment, we're not saying that there's a desperate panic in New Zealand, that things have gone very badly in this regard, but they have elsewhere, and we think it's time for us to kind of take some steps before, in case we blunder into the same kind of pitfall.
Well, what would those steps be? You mentioned the oversight agency, the independent Just what's the title you want to give it? Independent regulator.
Yeah,
what would it look like and its powers and role be?
Well, first of all, we should say that the government report that was carried out last year, the algorithm assessment report, painted a reasonably cheerful but a slightly mixed picture of what was happening across government agencies. Some seem to have pretty good procedures in place already, others are in the process of developing them, others may be a bit less so. So we think some consistency for a start would be a nice idea. What we would imagine would be that the government agency that proposes to use an algorithm, either a new algorithm or an existing algorithm in a new way, because these are versatile tools. You know, you can buy it for a certain purpose, and then some clever person thinks, well, actually, you could repurpose this for something a wee bit different. So they would have an internal process. They would check this for things like accuracy, because that's something we can't take for granted. I mean, some stories we've heard, again, overseas have shown some of these tools have been used for years and years and years, and no one's actually ever checked that they even work. So that would be the first stage. The second thing is to do with transparency. Can we check it? Can we see how it works and understand how it works? If someone wants to actually appeal against this decision, can we give them a good reason as to how the decision was arrived at? It would check it for things like bias and human rights considerations, and we would imagine they would prepare a kind of a report within the agency itself, which would then be sent to this oversight body. If the oversight body was reasonably satisfied, that would be the end of the story. But the oversight body would have the capacity, if they're not satisfied, to demand answers to other questions. But the second really important thing it would do, Catherine, is to say the nature of these tools is it can't just be a one-time for all-time check. Some of the mistakes, some of the dangers that have crept in, evidence of bias, for instance, they haven't become apparent for years. So what we're proposing is that there needs to be a regular checking and rechecking of the perhaps completely inadvertent effects that these systems have. So that's how we're proposing this would work. There's an awful lot of detailed work still to be done. We're talking to the government and government agencies about where this could be based, who would be on it and what have you. But that's broadly speaking how we think things ought to go.
There'd be a public register that would tell you which agencies were using algorithmic tools and in which decision making?
Exactly that. Yeah, that's right. So we think that the report last year from government was a really good start, but it can't be the end point. So this would have to be a register that's maintained and kept up to date so that we can have a look and see what kind of tools are being used to inform decisions about me. And we can ask the kind of questions, I mean, we as citizens, we as academics, and you as the media can ask questions about, has this been, for example, has this tool been tested against the New Zealand population? Or is it something you bought off the shelf from the USA that maybe isn't a good fit for our population at all?
The idea that algorithms ought to be publicly inspectable. This is the idea that the black box is open. Now, this is a matter that goes well beyond state agencies as a discussion right now. But let's begin with the state agencies. Yeah. As it stands now, can anyone go up to whichever of these 14 agencies is using an algorithm and say, I want to see what that algorithm's instructions are?
Well, that's a very good question. We've found out some pretty good information about this. I mean, we have some pretty good legal remedies, or legal rights in this country. The Official Information Act, for example, allows us a right to reasons. We can be given reasons for decisions about us. Precisely how much detail they disclose is a contestable matter, and the reason for that is, in some contexts, you can imagine the government agency saying, if we disclose absolutely everything about this algorithm and absolutely every variable and every weighting and all the rest of it, then it becomes awfully easy to game the system, right? You're basically telling people what answers to give if they want a particular outcome. So we get that there is a bit of a trade-off, perhaps, when it comes to the really fine-grained detail about how they work. But having said that, we think there are really strong reasons for openness and accountability in this regard, partly for reasons of public trust, partly to inspect that they're actually working as they should be, and partly so we can guard against these biases that have a habit of creeping in.
Is there not a middle ground? For example, some of those factors that might go into the algorithm are unchangeable. Your age, your date of birth,
Sure.
and various other personal matters. If it was something like how long you had been on a waiting list or how long you had been in employment, could you not leave the number out but leave the factor in?
Definitely, and definitely the default setting should be to make the information available and to disclose. I think the burden should always be on the agency to give a good reason why they can't show how the decision is being made. And in most cases, I imagine, there won't be a particularly good reason. They should be able to be open about it.
The reason for this is that one developing area of journalism in the future, undoubtedly and already, in an investigative sense, is data journalism. When you are holding organisations to account, it will increasingly be about the use of data in analysis and decision-making.
For sure.
And wonderful to have an independent agency, but as with any kind of journalism or other investigation and advocacy work, the more eyes on it and the more varied eyes on it, the better.
Absolutely.
Can you see this being built in or not? Is it realistic or not? Similar to the way the OIA does ask for hard facts and data now, just not in algorithmic form.
Well, so here's the thing. If we're thinking about making explanations and information available, we probably need to think about who's asking and what they want. If it's an ordinary citizen who's been at the sharp end of one of those decisions, in all fairness, they probably don't want to see the code. They probably don't want to see a highly technical explanation. They want an explanation in terms that a layperson can understand. So that needs to be possible. It needs to be possible to explain to them which factors, which variables influence the decision. But there's another level of accountability, as you were saying, that there are people in the media, people in academia who have a higher level of technical expertise, and there's a huge public interest in, the kind of citizen science model, if you like, a huge public interest in having all of those eyes on the system, checking it for the kind of errors that
it is looking for systemic bias and systemic error making. And right now, I suppose it does that with existing data provided by existing agencies and does the number crunching itself. Once that data has gone through another whole process, an algorithmic decision-making process, it's a missing factor in the analysis, potentially. This also goes further, as I said, than the state. I know the first body of work looks at the use of algorithms so far by the state here. And by the way, did you see any use that alarmed you by any of these agencies?
By New Zealand agencies?
Yes.
In all honesty, no. I wouldn't say that we're alarmed by anything we've seen that's happening here. We've been very alarmed by some of the things we've seen overseas, but we think that the degree of transparency and openness that we've seen here has been quite encouraging, but as I say, absolutely not a recipe for complacency.
So you look so far at state agencies, there's more work to come, because another big debate right now is the likes of communications, online communications, democratic tools that have changed, or democratic platforms that have changed.
Absolutely.
And again, everyone wants to know, what is the algorithm behind the driving of a given information platform, say, dissemination platform. So is this going to form part of your future work? Yes.
So it's not actually part of this same project, but some of our researchers down here at Otago are looking at precisely this. So the kind of ranking and recommender algorithms that social media networks and search engines use are becoming a real big area for concern, because, they're becoming, in many cases, the predominant mechanism by which people access news and other information. And the order in which they choose to present things to us and the content that they choose to recommend or equally to not recommend are becoming enormous factors. There's concerns about things like filter bubbles. You know that if your search history creates a profile of you, that leads to you just being given more and more and more of the same. At the same time, there's concern about people being radicalised or pushed down a road towards more extreme views, driven not so much by the system or by the algorithm's desire to turn you into a violent extremist, but by its desire to keep your eyes on the screen and to keep you clicking. So that's going to be a project that we're hoping to get underway pretty soon.
Again, it may be a case of forcing, undoubtedly, some of these organisations to reveal some of what is in that black box.
But well, that's the first thing. Yeah,
it will be a much longer story, I imagine, than this one. So, Colin, what happens with this work now? You mentioned that you were talking to government agencies. Are you expecting some kind of a formal response? What have they said about how they want to use your work?
We've had a pretty positive response so far, Catherine. They've been speaking very positively about what we've said, and we are quite optimistic that this could lead to some actual tangible outcomes. Whether it's precisely what we've recommended obviously remains to be seen. We know there will be operational and budgetary and political considerations, But we think this is a really good start, and we've been quite encouraged. We'll see how it goes. Ask us again in 6 months. But we've been quite encouraged by the responses, feedback we've had so far.
Thank you, Colin Gavaghan, Associate Professor at Otago University, one of the co-authors of this study funded by the Law Foundation, the University of Otago Artificial Intelligence and Law Project Study. There's a link on our webpage if you want to learn more.